Well, DeSantis appears to be gaining in the gubernatorial race. It says Republican gubernatorial candidate Adam Putnam has drawn thousands of Republican activists to rallies and barbecues across the state and held dozens of well-attended up-and-atom breakfasts, talks with likely primary voters. On the ground, however, they say that DeSantis might be winning, so keep an eye out for that. Also, I noticed that there's a headline in the sports section, and this is how a star is born. It says, Blake Snell's road to all-star isn't unusual, but his work, drive, and beliefs might be. And then, of course, the poor governor, he has a whole page here. Someone complaining about decisions he's made, and I'm sure he would just as soon not be a front-page person some of the days. If there was a Jerusalem Herald, a Jerusalem Journal back 1,000 years before Christ, the headline that day may have read something like, Saul killed. Jonathan, his son, also killed. And then perhaps in the article it may say something like, the family escapes to an unknown location. Because back then, as you know, when a king took over, it was not through an election like we have here in the States. They would have to kill the other kings, and very few kings came to the end of their term without losing their life. And so one king would be defeated, and the other king would follow him in there. And so nowadays in our country, we hear politicians kill each other with words prior to the election and sometimes after, but in those days, it was a life and death experience when someone came to office of a kingdom. And the reason they would often kill the whole family of those who preceded them was so there wouldn't be an uprising. So there wouldn't be a coup somewhere coming up from the previous king's family. And so they had to kill off the whole family. That was the custom. And so Saul, as you know, was king. And he was fighting to keep his throne. And his son Jonathan, who was, of course, David's BFF, was fighting with him to keep the kingdom. And they were both killed in the war. You know this story. And David had been anointed by God to be the king of Israel. And Saul's family fled for their lives. The back page person we're going to think about for a few moments today actually did not want to be anywhere near the media. He didn't even want to make the back page because he wanted to be in a place that was unreachable. He was one of the last remaining descendants of King Saul and Jonathan. We read about him actually in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4. We introduce ourselves to this person who has a long, strange name. 2 Samuel 4:4 says, Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled. And his name was Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, a young man who was crippled his entire life because when his nurse was trying to take him to escape to prevent being killed by the incoming king, or so she thought, he was dropped and was crippled. And they went to a place called Lodabar. Now, Lodabar is a place that you can't get there from anywhere. It's way up here. Here's Jerusalem. And to get to Lodabar, it's about 50 miles or so as the crow flies, but no one traveled by crow back then. So probably it would have been 80 or 90 miles trip over the mountains, over the rivers, and through the valleys to get from Jerusalem to Lodabar. Mephibosheth did not want to be found. And he grew up in this place. In fact, the term Lodabar actually describes this place. Lodabar means, in the original language, I'm told, a wilderness, a desolate place, a barren place, a place of no pasture. Lodabar, as far away as he could be from the action going on, as far away as he could be from the media of that day. And Mephibosheth grew up in this place of barrenness, this place of no pasture, this place, this wilderness place called Lodabar. And he hobbled around and he grew up there. And for the next 20 years, he found a wife and he got married. And he farmed the land up there as best as you could. And he had children there. So his life had been in Lodabar for some time now. Now, let's take our minds from the barren place. Let's go to the palace. And David is in the palace. And 2 Samuel chapter 9 tells us this story. And David's thinking about the great time, the blessings that God has given him as king in that country. And the army was the strongest it's ever been during that time. The people were generally happy in the kingdom. There was peace in the land. In fact, it was said of that day, there was a chicken in every pot and grapes on every vine. That reminds me of the Salvation Army. Someone has said that whenever Salvationists get together to eat, a chicken dies. Don't we love to eat? Anyway, there was a chicken in every pot and grapes on every vine in Jerusalem at that time. And David was thanking God for the many blessings that God had given him and bestowed upon him as king there. And he was reflecting on his relationship with Jonathan, his best friend. And in an act of grace, he asked this questions in chapter 9, verse 1. David asked kind of to the air, he says, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" In other words, David's saying, is there anyone in Saul's family, the previous monarch, anyone in his family to whom I can show some grace? Anyone I can show some mercy because God has shown so much grace and mercy to me? What a challenge for you and I today to look back on the blessings God has given to each one of us and people who've had an impact on our lives. And everyone here, I would probably say that we can think of someone who's had an impact on our life and helped us to be where we are today. I heard someone say that when this person's name comes to mind who had a good influence on us, we can send them a quick text. You have permission to do that right now, and I won't even be bothered by that. Or an email or a phone, not a phone call here, but just a text or an email maybe, to let them know what a great person they were in our lives. What a great idea to thank them, those who've touched our lives. And David wanted to show kindness to someone, anyone, for the blessings that he had with his best friend Jonathan. So, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned Ziba to appear before David the king. And David said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And Ziba says, "At your service," he replied. The king asks again, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness?" Can't you see Ziba's face? Can't you imagine what he thought? "Well," he says, "there is still one. There's one alive from the house of Saul. And he's a son of Jonathan, and it says here, he is lame in both feet." I can see Ziba saying to the king, "Well, yes, there's one, but he's lame. But he's a cripple." I can see between those lines, I can see Ziba kind of sensing, "Listen, Sir King, I know of one, but he's not the kind of person that should be around here. He's not the kind of person you want to be here." In fact, I can see Ziba almost sensing, well, he's not like us. And King David said, "Go get him." So all the king's horses and all the king's men put Lodabar in their GPS, and they traveled there to find this crippled man. Now imagine now, Mephibosheth. He's living his life. He's has family. He's tilling the crops. And all of a sudden, in this nowhere land of Lodabar, all these kings' horses and chariots, and everyone comes up and rolls up here. Can't you imagine that Mephibosheth thought to him, "It took me 20 years to hide myself, and now they finally found me." Can't you imagine him saying, "Can't they just leave me alone? I'm here. I have my life now. What in the world is the king doing here? You have your throne, King David. What more do you want?" He may have thought. And so they whisk Mephibosheth up and they take him to the palace in Jerusalem. And they bring him into the royal throne. Imagine that. They bring him into the royal throne room. And Mephibosheth falls on his face, trembling, and he says to the king, I am your servant, probably expecting to lose his life. And can't you see David? It says, David raised him up and said to him, don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I'll restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. 4 times David says that in this passage. Read it in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel 9. 4 times David says, listen, you will eat at my table. Chuck Swindoll paints a beautiful word picture that I can't do justice, but I'll try to explain it to you. Imagine, if you will, and you have permission to close your eyes, imagine it's dinner time in the royal household, in the palace. And the table is there, and the dinner bell rings, the chime rings, and it's time for the family to gather for dinner. And in walks King David in all his majesty and his robes, and he sits at the head of the table. Then in a few minutes, then Amnon, clever, crafty Amnon comes in, and he sits down next to the king. And then Solomon comes in from his study, always preoccupied with something, always working on something in his mind, thinking some thought, some heavy thought, and the heir apparent comes and finds his seat at the table. Absalom, the warrior with that long black hair running down to his shoulders, comes in kind of rough and tough and tumble, and he finds his place at the table. Tamar glides in her beautiful robes, and she comes to her place at the table, and there's one seat left. And they wait. And they hear the clump, clump, clump of crippled feet and crutches. The awkward movement of Mephibosheth as he awkwardly comes and finds his seat reserved for him at the king's table, and he plops into his seat. At that moment, all around the table are equals. And all of his imperfections, all of his crippledness, all of Mephibosheth's scars are hidden under the table of grace. Do you think Mephibosheth knew about grace? Do you think he knew what it was to be honored and blessed and having nothing he could provide? The Bible has a way of telling us about God, doesn't it? And God is in this story. Don't you see God here? Because you see, Mephibosheth had fellowship with his father for some time, for a short time. And many years before that, God placed our first parents in a garden, and he had fellowship with them for some time. And they had fellowship with their father until disaster struck. When disaster struck Mephibosheth's life, then fear pervaded his life. He suffered a fall that crippled him for the rest of his life. When moral disaster struck that garden and struck those 2 humans from the human race, humanity suffered a fall. And that fall left you and me crippled while living on this earth, crippled by the sin nature with which we were born. But David the king, out of his love for his friend Jonathan, looked for someone to whom he could show grace for his friend Jonathan. And God likewise, God the Father, because of his unconditional love for you and for me and the acceptance of the sacrifice of his son on the cross, he continues to seek out anyone at all who will accept him so that God can demonstrate his grace for you and for me. When David asked the question, is there anyone of the house of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? He didn't say, is there anyone worthy enough? David didn't say, is there anyone qualified enough? David didn't say, is there anyone good enough? He says, is there anyone at all? This crippled man had nothing to offer. He deserved nothing. In fact, he didn't even try to win the king's favor. He was running away from the king. And all he could humbly do was accept the grace that the king provided for him. And you and I have nothing to offer. You and I can do nothing to earn it. All you and I can do is to humbly accept the gift of God's grace for you and for me by plucking us from our place of barrenness, from our Lodabar, from our place of no pasture, and bringing us into his household and allowing us to be at his table. The king took this crippled man from where he was and brought him into fellowship with him. And we also are allowed to have that fellowship with our King. I want to read again the passage that Colonel Canning read to us. I'm reading out of a version called The Voice. The word's a little different, the meaning's the same, but listen to God's word taken from Ephesians chapter 2. But God, with the unfathomable richness of his love and mercy, focused on us, united us with the Anointed One, and infused our lifeless souls with life. Even though we were buried under mountains of sin, and saved us by his grace. Verse 8 says, for it's by God's grace you have been saved. You receive it through faith. It was not our plan or our effort. It is God's gift, pure and simple. You didn't earn it. Not one of us did. So don't go on bragging that you must have done something amazing. When Mephibosheth sat at the king's table, he was treated as one of the king's children with all the privileges and all the benefits of a child of the king. One day, you and I will sit at a king's table. We'll sit there with Moses, with Paul, with Andrew, with Peter, with Mrs. O, with Linda Garrett, with Dan Proctor, with my dad. And nobody will have status. Nobody will have rank, because we will all be the same. And our crippleness will be covered by the table of God's grace. Every one of us is undeserving. We're all cripples. And how you and I will sing praises to God for the grace that he showed to us. But you know what? We don't have to wait until that day to receive his grace, because God's grace is not only for the future. God's grace is for now. It covers us today, and this can be reality for you and me today, here in this place. We can accept that. When the unexpected happens to us, we can demonstrate God's grace. When words come to us and hurt us deeply, we can claim God's grace. When we are misunderstood, we can claim his grace upon us. God's grace can cover our woundedness today, here, and now. God's grace can cover our brokenness today, here, and now. And we have the privilege of accepting God's grace today, here, and now. And I pray that we live every moment in the awareness of God's grace to each one of us. But not only that, but through us, we can demonstrate God's grace to others, can't we? God's grace flowed from David to Mephibosheth. God's grace flowed from the cross to each one of us. And God's grace can flow from us to the broken world outside these walls. We're going to sing a song that's probably no better song to talk about God's grace, and we all know it. We don't need the words. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch, a cripple like me. I was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Maybe we can sing this song. Maybe as this song speaks to us, we can thank God for the grace he's bestowed upon us. We can say, God, I want to once again thank you for your grace given to me, which is unearned. I can't deserve it. I can't work for it, but it's given to me free and clear. Maybe we want to come down here and just say, Lord, I want to thank you for that grace. Or maybe we want to say, Lord, I want you to show me how I can funnel that grace to other people. There's people around me that need that grace, and maybe I'm the one through whom that grace can be imparted. Maybe you want to come down here and say, Lord, who is it to whom you would like me to share that grace? There might be one or two here who've never received that grace, because the grace is contingent upon us receiving it. And if you've never received that grace of God and felt like you somehow have to be good enough and work to be good enough and check off the boxes, I've done these things, so I'm good enough to be his, maybe we need to come down and say, listen, Lord, I can't do anything to earn it, but I want to receive your grace right now. We're going to sing all the verses of this song because all the verses are just amazing. And if God is speaking to you and if he wants you to come down here and thank him or ask for guidance or receive his grace, I would invite you to do so. Let's sing on Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound. Amazing Grace. God, we thank you for the grace you bestowed upon us. We thank you that it's a free gift. We can't boast about it. Mephibosheth had nothing to give, nothing to offer, but he was given grace beyond measure. And God, you've given each one of us who believe grace beyond measure, beyond what we deserve, because we deserve none. Thank you for the reminder this day, and bless us each one. And may we be vessels through which grace can also be given to those around us who need that special touch, who need that touch of grace that comes from you. For it's in your holy and precious name we pray.